Her husband warned me to stay away from his wife. I listened, at first. But one quiet conversation changed everything, and by the time the truth came out, it was already too late. I first met her on a quiet Saturday afternoon, the kind of slow day where nothing remarkable is supposed to happen. I had stopped by a small neighborhood cafe to escape the heat and finish some work on my laptop. The place was calm, soft music playing in the background, the faint aroma of fresh coffee drifting through the air, and only a few people scattered across the room. That's when I noticed her. She walked in with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need attention to command it. She looked to be in her early 40s, graceful and composed, dressed simply but elegantly. Her dark hair rested neatly on her shoulders, and there was something warm about her presence, the kind that made people instinctively glance up when she entered a room. But what caught my attention wasn't just her appearance. It was the way she looked around the cafe, almost thoughtfully, as if she were taking a brief break from a life that rarely slowed down. The only empty seat left happened to be the one at the table beside mine. She offered a polite smile before sitting down, the kind of small, friendly gesture that people exchange without expecting a conversation to follow. Still, a few minutes later, when the barista accidentally brought her the wrong drink, she laughed softly and shook her head. I couldn't help but smile at the moment, and when she noticed, she smiled back. That small moment turned into a simple conversation. "First time they've messed up my order," she joked, lightly tapping the cup with her fingers. Her voice was calm, warm, and easy to listen to. There was nothing forced about the way she spoke, just a natural friendliness that made the conversation flow. We talked about ordinary things at first. The cafe, the neighborhood, the unbearable summer heat. But somehow the conversation kept drifting forward, like we had known each other longer than a few minutes. At one point she laughed at something I said and lightly touched my arm, just for a second. It was a small, casual gesture, but it carried a warmth that caught me slightly off guard. Not inappropriate. Just unexpectedly personal. That was also the moment I noticed the ring on her finger. A simple wedding band that glimmered softly as her hand moved back to the table. She mentioned her husband casually during the conversation, not with excitement, but more like someone mentioning a familiar detail of their life. There was no bitterness in her tone, but there was something else there, something distant. Almost like the subject carried a quiet weight she didn't want to unpack in a casual conversation. Still, she smiled easily. Confident. Composed. Yet every now and then, when the conversation paused for a moment, I noticed a faint tiredness in her eyes, the kind that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from something deeper. When she finally stood up to leave, she offered another warm smile. "It was nice talking to you," she said gently. And just like that, she was gone. But as I sat there watching the cafe door close behind her, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that meeting her hadn't been as ordinary as it seemed. At the time, I didn't know how much that simple conversation would end up changing things. Or how complicated one small connection could become. A few days passed after that afternoon at the cafe, and life went back to its usual rhythm. Work, errands, the ordinary routine that fills most days without much thought. I assumed that brief conversation with her had been nothing more than a pleasant, forgettable moment between two strangers. But then I saw him. It happened one evening while I was walking back from the grocery store. The sun was beginning to set, casting long orange shadows across the quiet neighborhood street. As I turned the corner toward my building, a man standing beside a parked car caught my attention. He looked like he was waiting for someone. When our eyes met, he gave a small nod, the kind neighbors exchange in passing. I nodded back politely and kept walking, but as I got closer, he spoke. "Hey, you're the guy from the cafe, right?" His voice was calm, steady. Not aggressive, not confrontational. Just direct. I stopped, slightly confused. "The cafe?" I asked. "With my wife," he clarified. That's when it clicked. The woman from a few days ago. Up close, he looked to be in his mid-40s. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the quiet presence of someone who was used to being in control of situations. His expression wasn't angry, but it was serious in a way that immediately made the conversation feel heavier. "I'm Mark," he said, extending his hand. I shook it. His grip was firm but brief. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt strangely deliberate, like he was choosing his next words carefully. "I'm not here to cause a problem," he finally said. "I just wanted to talk to you for a minute." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten slightly. There was no accusation in his tone, but there was a quiet tension underneath his calm voice. "I remember seeing you two talking," he continued. "At the cafe." I nodded slowly. "Yeah. Just a conversation." "I figured," he said. Another pause followed. Then he exhaled quietly, rubbing the back of his neck like someone preparing to say something uncomfortable. "Look, my wife is a friendly person. Maybe a little too friendly sometimes." He wasn't smiling when he said it. His eyes stayed locked on mine, steady and unreadable. "I'm not accusing you of anything," he continued. "But I've seen situations start the same way before." The weight of what he was implying settled in the air between us. "She likes attention," he added quietly. "And sometimes she doesn't realize when things are crossing a line." His voice didn't carry anger. If anything, it carried something closer to exhaustion. "I'm just asking you, as a man to another man, keep a little distance." The request wasn't loud or threatening. It was calm. Controlled. But it felt serious. I nodded almost immediately. "Of course," I said. "Honestly, it was just a quick conversation." "I believe you," he replied. For the first time, his expression softened slightly. "I'm just trying to avoid problems before they start." The honesty in his voice made it hard to argue with him. In his position, I probably would have done the same thing. After another brief silence, he gave a small nod. "All right," he said. "I appreciate it." Then he turned, got into his car, and drove away. I stood there for a moment after he left, replaying the conversation in my head. The whole exchange had been calm. Respectful, even. Still, something about it lingered in my thoughts longer than I expected. That quiet warning should have been enough for me to keep my distance. And at the time, I fully intended to. But life has a strange way of bringing people back into your path, especially the ones you're supposed to avoid. After my conversation with her husband, I told myself the situation was simple. Keep your distance. It wasn't difficult advice to follow. I had only spoken to her once, after all. A brief conversation in a cafe. Nothing more. I figured our paths probably wouldn't cross again anyway. For a while, they didn't. Days passed, then nearly 2 weeks. Life stayed busy enough that the whole situation slowly faded to the back of my mind. Until one evening changed that. I had stopped by a small bookstore downtown after work. It was one of those quiet places where time seemed to slow down, the soft rustle of pages, the faint smell of paper and coffee from the tiny cafe corner inside. Only a few people wandered between the shelves. I was browsing through a section of novels when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Well, this is a surprise." I turned around. And there she was. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled, that same warm, effortless smile I remembered from the cafe. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi," I replied, a little caught off guard. Up close, she looked just as composed as before. Dark hair resting over her shoulders, a light summer blouse, the same calm confidence in the way she carried herself. But there was also something else in her expression. Relief. Almost like she was genuinely happy to see a familiar face. "I didn't expect to run into you again," she said. "Yeah, me neither," I admitted. For a brief second, I remembered her husband's warning. The conversation on the street. The quiet request to keep my distance. Part of me considered ending the conversation politely right there. But she was already standing beside me, holding a book she had just picked up from the shelf. "Do you come here often?" she asked. Sometimes, I said. It's quieter than most places. She nodded with a small laugh. Exactly why I like it. We ended up walking together through a few of the aisles, talking about books, movies, and the neighborhood. The conversation felt easy again, natural in a way that didn't require effort. Eventually we settled at a small table near the cafe corner, each with a cup of coffee. For a while, the conversation stayed light. But gradually, something shifted. The pauses between topics grew a little longer. Her smile softened. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a quieter tone. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." She looked down at her cup for a moment before speaking. "Do you ever feel like people assume your life is perfect just because it looks stable from the outside?" The question caught me slightly off guard. "I guess that happens sometimes," I said carefully. She nodded slowly. "Most people see my life that way," she admitted. "Nice house. Long marriage. Everything neat and predictable." She gave a small, almost ironic smile. "But sometimes predictable just means lonely." The honesty in her voice was unexpected. Without really thinking, I said, "That sounds hard." She looked up at me then, and for a moment her eyes held something fragile behind their calm surface. "Some days it is." As she spoke, her hand slowly moved across the table, resting lightly over mine for a brief second, a gentle, instinctive gesture. Not flirtatious. Just human. The warmth of her touch surprised me enough that I glanced down at our hands. She seemed to realize it too and quickly pulled her hand back with a small, apologetic smile. "Sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to do that." "It's okay," I said. But the moment lingered in the air between us. And as we sat there in the quiet corner of the bookstore, I couldn't ignore the thought quietly forming in the back of my mind. Her husband's warning suddenly felt a lot more complicated than I first believed. After that afternoon at the bookstore, I told myself something had to change. Not because anything inappropriate had happened, it hadn't. We had talked, shared a few honest moments, and that was it. Still, the quiet weight of her husband's warning kept returning to my mind. So I decided to keep my distance. At least, that was the plan. But the strange thing about small neighborhoods is how often people's paths cross when they least expect it. A week later, I ran into her again during an evening walk through the park near my apartment. The sun was beginning to sink behind the trees, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. The park was peaceful, just a few people walking their dogs or sitting quietly on benches. I noticed her sitting alone on one of those benches, looking out across the small pond in the center of the park. For a second, I considered turning around. But before I could, she looked up and saw me. Her face immediately brightened. "Well, if this keeps happening, people might start thinking we planned it," she said with a soft laugh. I smiled politely, stepping closer. "Yeah, it does seem like we're running into each other a lot." "Maybe it's the universe," she joked. I sat down at the opposite end of the bench, leaving a respectful space between us. For a few minutes we simply talked about ordinary things again, work, the changing weather, the quietness of the park. But gradually, the conversation deepened the way it always seemed to with her. She spoke about her days feeling repetitive, like every week followed the same script. Wake up, handle responsibilities, smile through social gatherings, go to bed, repeat. "It's strange," she admitted quietly. "You can spend years building a life, and still feel like you're just moving through it." Her voice carried that same quiet honesty I had heard in the bookstore. I listened carefully, unsure what to say but wanting her to feel heard. At one point she laughed softly at something I said, and without thinking she lightly nudged my shoulder with hers. The small gesture felt playful, almost natural. But the space between us slowly grew smaller after that. Not intentionally. Just gradually. The evening breeze moved gently through the trees as the sky darkened. The park lights flickered on one by one, casting soft golden circles across the walking paths. At some point during the conversation, she leaned back against the bench and sighed quietly. Then, after a long pause, she did something unexpected. She rested her head briefly against my shoulder. The movement was slow and hesitant, like she wasn't entirely sure she should do it. For a moment, I froze. Her hair brushed lightly against my arm, and I could feel the warmth of her presence beside me. The contact wasn't heavy or demanding, just the quiet closeness of someone who needed a moment of comfort. But the moment carried more weight than either of us expected. After a few seconds, she seemed to realize what she had done. She quickly straightened up, brushing her hair back and letting out a small, nervous laugh. "I'm sorry," she said. "That was probably inappropriate." I shook my head gently. "It's okay." But the truth was, we both knew something had shifted. Nothing dramatic. No lines openly crossed. Yet the boundary between friendly conversation and something deeper had begun to blur. And as we sat there in the quiet park, neither of us seemed quite sure where that line was anymore. For a while, things stayed quiet. Not perfect. Not simple. But quiet. After that evening in the park, I tried to convince myself that our connection was still harmless. We weren't doing anything wrong, at least not in the obvious sense. We talked, shared long conversations, and occasionally ran into each other during walks or errands. But even if nothing physical had happened, the truth was harder to ignore. Something emotional had begun to grow between us. The kind of connection that doesn't happen instantly, but builds slowly through shared moments, long conversations, and the comfort of feeling understood. And deep down, I knew that kind of connection could be just as dangerous. For a few weeks, everything remained under the surface. No confrontations. No obvious problems. Just the quiet tension of something that probably shouldn't exist. Then one evening, everything changed. I had just returned home from work when I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, she was standing there. For a second, I didn't know what to say. She rarely came by unannounced. Usually our meetings were accidental or planned casually through messages. But tonight something was different. Her expression was tense, her posture stiff like she had rushed over without thinking things through. "Can we talk for a minute?" she asked quietly. I stepped aside and let her in. The moment the door closed behind her, she exhaled deeply and ran a hand through her hair. "He knows," she said. My stomach tightened. "Your husband?" She nodded. "He saw my phone." The words hung in the air like a weight pressing down on the room. I leaned against the counter, trying to process what she was saying. "Did he misunderstand something?" I asked carefully. She gave a tired smile. "No," she said softly. "He understood exactly what was happening." Before I could respond, another knock sounded at the door. This one was firmer. He didn't wait long before knocking again. We both froze. Her shoulders tensed as she slowly turned toward the door. "That's him," she whispered. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I walked over and opened the door. Her husband stood there, just as composed as the last time I had seen him. His expression wasn't explosive or furious. If anything, it was worse, controlled, disappointed. His eyes briefly scanned the room before settling on his wife. "I thought I might find you here," he said calmly. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to fill the entire apartment. She stepped forward slightly. "Mark," he held up a hand gently, stopping her before she could continue. "I warned you," he said quietly. The words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that made them impossible to ignore. Then he looked at me. Not with rage. Just with a kind of exhausted disappointment. "I told you I wasn't trying to start a fight," he said. "I just asked for a little distance." Guilt twisted in my chest. "You're right," I admitted. "I should have respected that." For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, she stepped between us slightly, her voice trembling. "Nothing happened," she said quickly. "We were just talking." Her husband looked at her carefully. "I know," he replied. That answer seemed to surprise both of us. But sometimes, he continued quietly, talking can be enough to break something. The truth in his voice made the room feel even smaller. And in that moment, I realized something painful. The real damage wasn't what had happened. It was the line we had slowly crossed without fully admitting it. After that night, everything stopped. The conversations. The messages. The accidental meetings that never really felt accidental. It was like someone had quietly closed a door between our lives. At first, the silence felt strange. For weeks, I kept expecting my phone to light up with a message from her, something simple, like "Are you free to talk?" or "I hope you're doing okay." But nothing came. And slowly, the quiet became normal. I threw myself into work, longer hours, more distractions. It helped keep my mind from replaying the confrontation with her husband, the disappointment in his voice, the tension that had filled the room. I kept reminding myself that ending things had been the right choice. Still, some nights I found myself walking past the same park bench where we had once sat together. The place looked exactly the same, the trees, the pond, the soft glow of the lamps, but it felt different now. Empty in a way it hadn't before. Nearly a month passed before I heard from her again. It was a short message. "Can we meet once? Just to talk?" I stared at the phone for a long time before replying. Part of me knew it might reopen emotions that had barely started to settle. But another part of me felt like leaving things unresolved would linger even longer. So I agreed. We chose a quiet cafe across town, far from the neighborhood where anyone might recognize us. When I walked in, I spotted her immediately. She was sitting by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold. For a moment, I barely recognized her. Not because she looked drastically different, but because something about her energy had changed. The confident warmth she usually carried seemed softer now, almost fragile. When she saw me, she offered a small smile. "Hi." "Hi," I replied, sitting down across from her. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, just heavy with everything we both knew had happened. "You look tired," I said gently. She let out a quiet laugh. "That obvious?" Her fingers traced the edge of the cup slowly as she looked down. "Things have been difficult." I nodded, unsure how much I should ask. She eventually continued on her own. "Mark and I have been talking a lot," she said. "About everything." Her voice didn't carry anger or resentment. Just exhaustion. "He wasn't as angry as I expected," she admitted softly. "But he was hurt." I remembered the look on his face that night. It made sense. She glanced up at me then, her eyes reflecting a quiet sadness. "You know the worst part," she said. "What?" "He warned me." Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke. "He told me weeks ago that I needed to be careful about boundaries. That attention from someone new can feel exciting when your life feels stuck." She paused, shaking her head faintly. And I laughed it off. I didn't know what to say to that. Her hand slowly moved across the table for a moment, resting lightly near mine before stopping. This time, she didn't touch me. "I should have listened," she said quietly. There was no anger in her voice now, just the quiet weight of someone realizing their own mistake. I didn't think talking to someone who understood me could cause so much damage. I leaned back slightly, my chest tightening with the same guilt I had carried for weeks. "It wasn't just you," I said. But she shook her head gently. "No, but I was the one who had something to lose." Her honesty made the moment even heavier. And for the first time since everything had happened, we both fully understood what our connection had cost. After she said those words, the conversation slowed down. Not because we had nothing left to say, but because everything important had already been spoken. Outside the cafe window, people passed by on the sidewalk, living their normal lives. Cars moved through the intersection, and the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the street. Inside, it felt like time had paused at our table. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup again, though neither of us had taken a sip in a while. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she said quietly. I nodded, listening. "About my marriage, about the choices I made." Her voice wasn't defensive anymore. It carried the calm honesty of someone who had spent many nights replaying the same memories in her head. "Mark isn't perfect," she continued. "We've both made mistakes over the years." She looked out the window briefly before turning back to me. "But I made a promise to him once. And somewhere along the way, I stopped respecting what that promise meant." The words were simple, but they carried a quiet strength behind them. I could see the determination in her eyes now, the same confidence she had when I first met her, but tempered by everything that had happened since. "So what happens now?" I asked gently. She took a slow breath. "I'm going to try to fix things," she said. "If he's willing." Her fingers tapped lightly against the side of the cup as she spoke. "It won't be easy. Trust doesn't come back overnight." I nodded. "But I owe it to him to try." For a moment, neither of us spoke again. Then she looked at me with a faint smile, softer than the one I remembered from our first meeting. "And I owe you something too." "What's that?" I asked. "Honesty." She leaned back slightly in her chair, studying my face for a moment. "What we had, it meant something to me," she said. "Even if it was complicated." I felt a small knot tighten in my chest. "Me too," I admitted. She reached across the table then, this time letting her hand gently rest over mine. The touch was warm, familiar. But it felt different now. Not full of possibility like before. More like a quiet goodbye. "I'm glad we met," she said softly. "So am I." After a moment, she slowly withdrew her hand. The small absence of warmth made the moment feel even more real. She stood up first. I stood with her. For a second, we both hesitated, unsure how to end the moment. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me in a soft hug. It wasn't rushed. For a brief moment, she rested her cheek against my shoulder, the same gentle closeness we had shared that evening in the park. But this time, there was no confusion about what it meant. It was closure. When she stepped back, there was a faint shine in her eyes, though she kept her smile steady. "Take care of yourself," she said. "You too." She turned toward the door, pausing only once before leaving. Then she walked out into the fading sunlight. I stayed there for a moment, watching the street through the cafe window. Some connections enter your life quietly. They don't last forever. They don't always become what you imagine. But they leave something behind, a lesson, a memory, a reminder of how complicated human emotions can be. And sometimes, the strongest thing two people can do for each other is simply let go.